Picture the scene, right? We are deep inside the royal courts of the ancient Near East. A wildly powerful Egyptian ruler, literally dripping in the wealth of an empire, is just weeping. And we're not talking about a quiet single tear here. This emotional collapse is so incredibly intense that the entire palace can actually hear him through the walls. Then he looks at this ragged, terrified group of men standing before him, and he drops a revelation that completely shatters their reality. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so pumped you're here with us today because we are going to dive into one of the absolute most profound narratives in all of ancient literature, Genesis 45. Specifically, we're looking at the sovereignty behind Joseph's story. We're going to systematically unpack how this one highly charged, incredibly intimate family reunion actually secures the fate of an entire nation. Because when you look closely, there is a massive cosmic design hiding just beneath all this human trauma. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today's journey. We'll start with the breaking point, then move right into the sovereignty paradox, followed by the sanctuary of Goshen, resurrecting Jacob's hope, and finally we'll wrap up with the grand promise plan. All right, part 1, the breaking point, looking at Joseph's emotional collapse. Just before revealing himself, Joseph issues this sudden, shocking command. He orders every single Egyptian official out of the room. Why? Well, he's actually doing it to guard his brother's collective honor. Despite everything they did to him, he's deliberately hiding their shameful past and their impending disgrace from foreign eyes to protect them from a public scandal. You see, the text tells us that up until this exact moment, Joseph had been barely holding it together. The Hebrew word used here is apaq, which means to restrain or compel oneself. It paints this incredibly vivid picture of a severe, just exhausting internal struggle. He's kept up this royal facade for so long, but after Judah's impassioned plea, that restraint completely fractures. He just abandons the whole act for pure, unperformed catharsis. But while Joseph is weeping his eyes out, his brothers are experiencing something very, very different. The text uses the word nibalu to describe their reaction. It means they are struck with absolute terror, just rendered silent and frozen. I mean, think about it. It perfectly captures this paralyzing realization. The supreme ruler of Egypt, the guy who literally holds the power of life and death over them during a global famine, is the exact same brother they betrayed and sold into slavery decades ago. Their speechlessness? Yeah, that is born of pure guilt and sheer panic. Which brings us to section 2, the sovereignty paradox. We're looking at how divine will overrides human malice. Instead of executing his brothers, which, let's be honest, he totally could have done, Joseph invites them closer. And what happens next is just incredible. He completely reinterprets his decades of suffering, the false accusations, the imprisonment, the betrayal. He doesn't look at his life through a lens of bitterness. He looks at it through the lens of a divine, redemptive design. And this brilliantly illustrates what we can call the sovereignty paradox. On one hand, we have grave human malice, right? You sold me into Egypt. Joseph is not letting them off the hook. He isn't minimizing their sin. They are absolutely, entirely morally culpable for their treacherous act. But layered right over top of that, we have divine sovereignty. God sent me before you to preserve life. God was the ultimate actor here. He literally took their evil intention and transformed it into an instrument of salvation. So why did God do this? Well, Joseph explains that God sent him to preserve a she'eret, a Hebrew term meaning a remnant or a surviving group. Joseph's survival and his crazy elevation in Egypt wasn't some random accident of history. There were still 5 brutal years of famine left. If Jacob's household perished in Canaan, the covenant sworn to Abraham would have completely failed. So God was operating covertly in the Egyptian courts to preserve this vital seed. That leads us right into section 3, the sanctuary of Goshen, or embodied forgiveness. Because, for this family's survival to actually work in the real world, they needed a concrete, physical, geographic sanctuary to ride out the rest of the famine. Now, what's really interesting here is how this completely redefines what's happening between these brothers. True biblical forgiveness is an active, embodied reality backed by practical resource allocation. Joseph doesn't just offer some passive sentiment. He doesn't just say, hey, I forgive you. He actually offers them the incredibly fertile district of Goshen. He's ensuring relational proximity and material security so they don't just collapse into poverty. And get this, Joseph isn't even acting alone here. Think about this incredible sequence of events. First, Pharaoh himself commands the brothers to literally take the best of Egypt. Second, royal Egyptian wagons, the agalot, are dispatched for transport. And finally, they're told the wealth of all Egypt is at their disposal. It's wild when you really think about it. God's providence has literally commandeered the immense institutional wealth of the Egyptian empire just to fund a road trip for this one covenant family. All right, on to section 4, Resurrecting Jacob's Hope, Tracking the Journey Home. So the brothers depart Egypt, and they're carrying all these royal gifts, grain, and a very specific parting charge from Joseph. Do not quarrel on the way. He knows their history of blame shifting all too well, and he is explicitly warning them not to resurrect any of that past bitterness on the road home. When they finally reach Canaan, they report the impossible news to their father, Jacob. They tell him Joseph is still alive, and he's ruler over all the land of Egypt. But Jacob's initial reaction, it is just heartbreaking. The text uses the word yapago to say his heart remained completely numb or cold. Decades of heavy, unrelenting grief have literally rendered him physically and emotionally incapable of immediately believing that this could possibly be true. But then, this beautiful transformation occurs. That deep numbness from decades of grief finally gives way, and his spirit is revived. And how does it happen? By seeing the Egyptian wagons. Mere words weren't enough. He needed tangible proof. When Jacob physically sees the royal wagons sent by Pharaoh, his long season of mourning finally comes to an end. Narratively speaking, this is this beautiful, subtle echo of life from the dead, a true, literal resurrection of hope. Let's move to our final section, the Grand Promise Plan, where we'll look at the cosmic repercussions of all this. We really have to zoom out here to understand how Joseph's story isn't just some isolated ancient family drama. It is a pivotal linchpin in the overarching biblical worldview.
Let's look at how this builds across the timeline of redemptive history. It starts at Babel with the disinheritance of the nations, right? Then we see the election of Abraham to bless the earth. And that brings us to Joseph, whose entire role is about preservation. I mean, had the family died in the famine, the timeline literally stops right there. Joseph is the absolutely crucial bridge that allows the covenant to survive, which ultimately leads to the Messiah.
And this is exactly why New Testament authors constantly draw direct theological lines right back to Genesis 45. It's so fascinating. In Acts 4, the theology of the cross is grounded right here. Just as Joseph was delivered up by a dark plot, yet driven by God's predetermined plan, so was the Messiah. Paul's famous claim in Romans 8:28 that God works all things for good, that is a direct echo of Joseph. And in Zechariah, Joseph's self-disclosure to his terrified brothers actually prefigures a future reconciliation for ethnic Israel. What this does is establish a really vital principle. The physical, historical preservation of ethnic Israel in Goshen isn't just some temporary illustration that we can just spiritualize away. It was a foundational requirement for fulfilling God's concrete promises. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that God continually sustains his chosen people, even through their profound human failings and their internal moral fractures. His commitment to the covenant simply outlasts their dysfunction. And that brings us to our final thought for this explainer. I really want you to consider this. If human malice, betrayal, and a devastating regional famine couldn't thwart the preservation of God's remnant, what does that reveal about the overarching faithfulness of God? It tells us that his redemptive design is completely unstoppable. It shows us that absolute sovereign grace can weave through the absolute darkest of human actions to preserve life. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today. I'll see you next time.